was supposed to be another ordinary late show taping, until Sarah Martinez walked onto the stage clutching a worn envelope like her life depended on it. The Ed Sullivan Theater hummed with its familiar energy, warm lights casting their golden glow across David Letterman's mahogany desk. At 63, he'd done this routine thousands of times, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the unusual guest request, a 16-year-old girl from Phoenix who'd insisted she had something important to share. 30 seconds to air, the floor manager called out. The audience applauded as Paul Schaffer's band struck the opening notes. David flashed his gap-toothed grin and launched into his monologue with practiced ease. The jokes landed perfectly, the audience laughed on cue, and everything moved like clockwork, until he introduced his final guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Martinez. She emerged from behind the blue curtain, and immediately something felt wrong. Sarah wasn't the typical late show guest. She wore a simple black dress that looked too formal for her young frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that made her seem older than her 16 years. But it was her eyes that stopped David mid-gesture. They held a weight that no teenager should carry. As Sarah approached the guest chair, the studio lights caught the envelope in her trembling hands. It was yellowed at the edges, clearly old, with writing that looked like it had been handled countless times. "Hi, Sarah," David said, settling into his hosting rhythm. "Welcome to the show. I understand you've traveled all the way from Phoenix to be here tonight." "Yes, sir." Her voice was steadier than he'd expected, but there was something fragile underneath. "I promised my dad I'd come." The audience stirred slightly. This wasn't following the usual late-night script. "Your dad sounds like a smart man," David replied, leaning back in his chair. "Is he watching tonight?" Sarah's composure cracked for just a moment. She looked down at the envelope, then back up at David with eyes that suddenly seemed to shimmer under the studio lights. He can't watch anymore, Mr. Letterman. He died 3 months ago." The studio fell silent. Not the comfortable pause between jokes, but a heavy, unexpected quiet that seemed to press against everyone present. For the first time in 30 years, David didn't know what to say. The prepared questions dissolved in his throat, leaving him exposed in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd agreed to have her on. "I'm sorry," he said softly, and meant it. "That must be incredibly difficult." Sarah nodded, clutching the envelope tighter. "He had pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 3 months, but he lasted 8. He was really strong." David found himself leaning forward, abandoning his usual relaxed posture. In the TUSV monitor, he could see his own face, the professional mask slipping away to reveal something more human underneath. "He must have been proud of you," David said. "He was." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "Even at the end, when the pain was really bad, he'd still watch your show with me every night. He said you were the only thing that could still make him laugh." Something shifted in David's chest. Not just professional sympathy, but something deeper. 32 years in television, and he'd built walls around moments like this. But this 16-year-old girl, with her father's words, was dismantling them brick by brick. This was real in a way that cut through all the stage lights and cameras and pretense. "Your father sounds like he had good taste," David said. But his usual self-deprecating humor felt hollow. Sarah smiled for the first time since sitting down. "He did. He was a mechanic. Worked on cars his whole life. But he said comedy was like fixing an engine. You had to know exactly which parts to touch to make everything run smooth." A few people in the audience chuckled softly, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from recognition, not entertainment. "He wrote me this letter," Sarah continued, holding up the envelope, before he couldn't write anymore. He made me promise not to read it until after he was gone, and then to bring it here and read it to you." David felt something he rarely experienced on camera: complete, overwhelming uncertainty. Every instinct he'd developed over 3 decades told him to find the joke, lighten the mood, guide this back to safe territory. But those instincts felt wrong now. almost insulting. This wasn't in any handbook for television hosts. There was no punchline coming, no commercial break to save him. Just a 16-year-old girl with a letter from her dead father, sitting in his guest chair under hot studio lights, asking him to witness her grief. Would you like to read it?" he asked quietly. Sarah's hand shook as she opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded multiple times, and when she unfolded it, David could see it was covered in careful, deliberate handwriting. The kind that comes from someone who doesn't write often but wants every word to count. "Dear Sarah," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you're reading this, then I'm not there to tell you these things myself anymore." The audience was completely still now. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. David found himself leaning forward despite every professional instinct telling him to maintain distance. Something about her father's words was reaching past his defenses, past 30 years of practiced emotional control. "I want you to know that every night we spent watching Mr. Letterman together were the best parts of my day, not because of the jokes, though they were pretty good, but because I got to hear you laugh. Even when I was sick, even when everything hurt, your laugh made me remember what I was fighting for." Sarah paused, looking up at David. His professional composure was completely gone now. He sat transfixed, one hand gripping the edge of his desk. "I need you to go to New York and tell Mr. Letterman something for me. Tell him that he gave a dying man the gift of hearing his daughter laugh one more time every single night. Tell him that's worth more than he could ever know." The silence in the studio was deafening. David felt tears gathering in his eyes, something that had never happened on camera, not in 3 decades of television. Every wall he'd built, every professional boundary he'd maintained, crumbled in the face of this simple, devastating truth. A father's love, delivered by his daughter to a stranger who'd unknowingly become part of their story. "And Sarah, honey, I need you to remember that even though I can't watch the show with you anymore, you can still laugh. Please keep laughing. It's the most beautiful sound in the world." Sarah's voice broke on the last words. She folded the letter carefully and looked up at David, who was now openly struggling to maintain his composure. That's what he wanted me to tell you," she whispered. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The cameras kept rolling, capturing a moment that felt too intimate for television, too real for the medium that trafficked in artificial moments and manufactured emotions. David stared at Sarah, then at the letter in her hands, trying to process what he'd just heard. In 32 years of hosting, he'd interviewed presidents and movie stars, comedians and musicians, but none of them had ever said anything that reached him quite like these words from a dying mechanic in Phoenix. He thought about all the times he'd made jokes about his own life, deflected serious moments with humor, kept the audience at arm's length. It had always worked before. But sitting here now, looking at this brave young woman who just shared the most precious thing she owned, her father's final words, he realized that sometimes the most important conversations happen when you stop trying to be entertaining and start trying to be human. Then David did something he'd never done in 32 years of hosting. He stood up from behind his desk. The movement surprised everyone, including himself. Later, he wouldn't remember deciding to do it. It was as if something deeper than conscious thought had taken over. He walked around the desk slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of every camera trained on him, until he was standing next to Sarah's chair. The studio lights caught the moisture in his eyes as he looked down at this brave young woman who traveled across the country to deliver a message from beyond. "Sarah," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "your father was wrong about one thing." She looked up at him questioningly. "He said I gave him the gift of hearing you laugh. But it's the other way around, you and your dad. You gave me something tonight that I didn't even know I needed." He paused, looking out at the audience, then back down at her. "He's still here, you know, in that laugh of yours. And every time you find something funny, every time you let joy into your life, that's him. Still fighting, still winning." The tears came freely now, for both of them. David reached out and gently placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Thank you for bringing me this letter. Thank you for sharing your father with us, and thank you for reminding me why we really do this." The audience began to applaud, but it wasn't the usual rhythmic clapping of a TV crowd. It was the scattered, emotional applause of people who'd witnessed something genuine, something that transcended entertainment and touched the deeper places of the human heart. Sarah stood up and, without thinking, hugged David. It was awkward and unplanned and completely off script, but it was real. The cameras caught it all. The moment when television stopped being television and became simply one person comforting another. David felt something break open in his chest. Some carefully maintained barrier between the performer and the person. He was crying now, not trying to hide it, not trying to turn it into a joke. Just feeling the full weight of what this girl had carried across the country to share with him. When they finally separated, David looked into the camera with an expression the audience had never seen before, completely open, completely vulnerable, the mask of perpetual irony finally set aside. "We'll be right back," he said, though everyone in the studio knew this was the kind of moment you don't come back from. This was the kind of moment that changes everything. As the show went to commercial, David sat back down behind his desk, but something fundamental had shifted. The letter lay on his desk now, next to his blue cards and coffee mug. A reminder that sometimes the most important conversations happen when you're not trying to be entertaining. He looked out at the audience, many of them wiping their eyes, and realized that what had just happened wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was exactly what television could be when it stopped hiding behind artifice and allowed real human connection to break through. The stage manager approached hesitantly. "David, we've got 2 more segments." David nodded, but he was somewhere else entirely, thinking about a mechanic in Phoenix who'd found comfort in late-night television, who'd fought cancer for 8 months with his daughter by his side, who'd used his final coherent moments to write a letter of gratitude to a stranger. Sarah Martinez returned to Phoenix the next morning, but she left something behind in that Ed Sullivan Theater. She left proof that laughter can be a form of love, that comedy can be a kind of medicine, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up and tell the truth. But more than that, she'd reminded everyone in that studio and the crew, the audience, and especially David, that behind every joke, every bit, every moment of manufactured entertainment, there were real people living real lives, finding comfort and connection in the most unexpected places. David would think about that often in the weeks that followed. How a dying man in Phoenix had found solace in his show. How love could travel through television waves and touch someone you'd never meet. How a 16-year-old girl could walk onto a stage and with nothing but her father's words remind a 63-year-old comedian why he'd started telling jokes in the first place. 3 months later, David would receive hundreds of letters from viewers who'd seen that episode. Parents writing about children they'd lost, children writing about parents who were sick, people sharing stories about love and loss and the healing power of laughter. But none would affect him like the simple note that arrived 6 months later, written in the same careful handwriting. "Mr. Letterman, I laughed today. Dad would have liked that. Thank you for helping me remember how. Sarah." He read it twice, then quietly folded it and placed it in his desk drawer next to his blue cards. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't rehearse his monologue. Instead, he sat thinking about the weight of laughter, the responsibility of joy, and the 16-year-old girl who'd taught him that sometimes the best shows are the ones that break your heart just a little bit. Because sometimes, when the cameras stop rolling and the audience goes home, what's left isn't entertainment, it's humanity. And that was the point all along.